Welcome to Talk World Radio, a half-hour discussion of politics as if the people mattered. I'm David Swanson. This week on Talk World Radio, we are speaking with Dmitry Babich in Russia about U.S. and Russian relations. Dmitry Babich is a journalist who has focused on Russian politics. He has been a senior correspondent at the Komsomolskaya Pravda daily, hope I said that correctly, RIA Novosti, and Russia Profile magazine. Between 1999 and 2003, Babich was foreign editor at the Moscow News before returning to Russia Profile in 2009 as acting editor-in-chief. His core areas of focus include Russia's modern political history, international relations, and he is also a political analyst at the Voice of Russia. Dmitry Babich, welcome to Talk World Radio.
Yes, nice to hear from you. Nice to see you. There's just a small correction. Voice of Radio does not exist anymore. So I'm a frequent guest on CTGN US. I used to be a lot on BBC and sometimes on CNN. I don't do it anymore because I don't find them quite, no media is objective, but lately they have become just too partisan for me. You can sometimes see me on RT. Yeah, I know that sounds terrible, but I hope during our conversation we'll find out who is a real peacenik and who is a real militarist. And I can only tell you that when I, at first appeared on RT, which was in 2004, it was a very different television station at the time. I never took money from them for that. So for a dozen years, I was kind of a volunteer. And I still give interviews to American, Arab, Chinese, Spanish television and radio stations which are interested in international politics. So that's about all about me. I can only add that I speak 5 European languages, and that kind of makes me more or less cognizant not only on Russian and US politics, but also on European politics, and to a certain extent, global South, which is, I think, the biggest mystery in our world today. So that's all. That's about it.
Well, we could go for days. We only have half an hour, but I'm sorry I didn't remember about Voice of Russia. I think even more recently, Voice of America is ceasing to exist. So I don't know if these are good changes or bad. But Dmitry, here in the U.S., a lot of people are just newly feeling the fear of what the U.S. government can do to them if they just say certain things like Free Palestine. In Russia, how free are you to say anything you want? Are you even free to tell me how free you are to say anything you want?
Well, of course, freedom, I don't believe in ratings of freedom. There is a strange organization in the US called Freedom House, which gives ratings, partially free, completely free.
Yes, and it's very
cannot measure
you
cannot measure it, but you immediately feel it. It's like oxygen. I don't know any machine that would tell you the exact percentage of oxygen in the air, but if you speak the language of a certain country, if you are a person who is interested in the outside world, the moment when you enter a certain country, you see whether it's free or not. You just open a newspaper, you watch television, you talk to people, and you immediately feel whether that country is free or not. I can tell you, I'm 54 years old. So when Gorbachev's reforms started in serious in 1987, I was 17 years old, and I was entering the Faculty of Journalism at Moscow State University. So I can tell you that between 1989 and 1995, Russia was one of the freest countries in the world. You could say just about anything, partly because society was so, I would say, innocent, so ignorant. After 70 years of censorship, people just did not realize which things were good or bad, and you could just say anything. which was fine because I think freedom is still better than absence of freedom. But you know, Soviet society was very diverse. In Russia itself, you know, in the Russian-speaking areas of Russia, we didn't have a lot of violence or turbulence when basically the country changed completely in 1991. But in the so-called ex-Soviet republics with Muslim population, sometimes with very poor population, there were civil wars. And so a lot of people had this prejudice against freedom of speech. They said freedom of speech leads to violence. Sometimes it does, you know, in an ignorant society, it does. But the Russian public was relatively well read. And as I told you, even though a lot of people were ignorant, they were not used to radical political discourse. They were more or less intelligent. So even when they heard radical political discourse, it didn't lead to violence immediately. Then what followed was a certain development. You know, as by the end of the 90s, it became clear that the revolution of 1991 was liberal, but not democratic. We've got a market economy, very competitive, sometimes cruel market economy, very much like the American one. But that economy did not need democracy, did not need freedom of speech, because you know, these so-called liberals, not real liberals, but Russian liberals, economic liberals, for them, freedom of speech was kind of an impediment. You know, they didn't want to be challenged by leftist parties. They didn't want to be responsible before their own workers, before the trade unions. So little by little, they just gave all the power to Boris Yeltsin, who became a lot more powerful legally. You know, the institution of presidency became much more powerful than it was originally in 1991.
Right.
And the new president, Vladimir Putin, did not have to do much in terms of limiting freedoms. He just inherited from Yeltsin that very, very powerful institution of presidency.
Right.
I would say that under Putin, especially in the first 15 years, the press was relatively free. There were huge chunks of pro-Western press, which the international media call the only independent media outlets. You know, if you agreed with Bill Clinton, if you agreed with George Bush the senior, George Bush the Jr., if you agreed with Obama, you were the independent media in Russia. I think that the real picture is a lot more complicated, as you and me will understand.
Yeah.
But of course, that's why I liked your programs. That's why I liked your speeches. You're one of the most principled enemies of war that I know in this world. And I agree with you 100%. I think it is impossible to have free press in a country that wages wars. And that is very much the case in Russia. We didn't choose the war in 2014. It was the coup orchestrated by the United States and the European Union that sort of set Ukraine on the course of civil war. The civil war continued since 2014. But in 2022, the Russian government, you know, aggravated it. I think that the intention of Putin when he launched the so-called military operation, he wanted to end the violence by basically crushing the Ukrainian army, crushing the apparatus of violence. But what happened was that we had 10 times more violence than before that decision. So of course, there are certain limitations on freedom. And what is very, very unfortunate, we hear hawkish voices in Russia more often than 10 years ago or 5 years ago. But I must tell you, still, the opponents of hawks in Russia, they are in better position than in the European Union, and sometimes even better than in the United States. Because in Europe, the mainstream, you know, if you are not, if you don't support the view that Russia is a threat and we need to arm ourselves to the teeth and we need to arm Ukraine to the teeth, then you are seen as an immoral person. In Russia, you are seen as someone who is politically wrong. In Europe, you are seen as someone morally wrong.
You're not
And this
seen
is,
as a traitor. You're not seen as an enemy. You're not arrested or put in jail for saying end the war now. You're seen as someone who's politically mistaken.
well, I can tell you that, of course, it depends. If you say, I hate Russia, I hate its president, I think this war is criminal, I support the United States, then, of course, you will have very negative reaction. You may be, if it's proven that you get money from abroad, you may be declared a foreign agent, which means that you cannot teach at school.
But
You can
assuming
leave,
you're
you can.
not paid by the United States and you say, I hate war, I like peace, stop the war.
Nothing will happen to you. I know a lot of people who say it, and they leave, and they continue to work in educational institutions. Well, I would say that under Putin, since the year 2000, the press became more competitive. It became more market oriented. So it became, I would say, ruder. It became more abrasive in its definitions. In the 90s, the press, after 70 years of Soviet censorship, the press was soft-spoken. You could say, if you were for liberals, if you were for cooperation with the West, if you were for Gorbachev, you could say, oh, we need to develop democracy. Russia needs more freedom. Under Putin, the same liberals became more abrasive. They always insulted people. They said, Russians have always been slaves. This is a slavish country. I hate it. I prefer the West. This was the kind of language that became very widespread in the 2000s, 2010s. And now, because of the war, this language may get you in trouble. So people who oppose the war, if they don't use insulting language, if they don't say terrible things about the army, I know such people, they continue basically to say what they have been saying all of their lives, all of their free lives.
Is there any way to tell what the majority opinion is? Is there any way to do a credible poll of the Russian public and say, this is what percentage supports continuing the war, and this is what percentage wants to end it?
Well, I participated in the work of Russian sociological centers, which collect opinions, and I always agreed to participate in such polls myself. And I must tell you that they are done pretty professionally. There are very strict rules. Which questions you are asking? Always several variants. So I can tell you my impression, and it's pretty much supported by the opinion polls. People were unhappy when the war started. Very few people were happy, saying, "Oh, this is the beginning of something good." People felt grief when it started.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that now they say just stop the war, give back all the territory, surrender and reestablish nice relations with the European Union and I don't know, with Obama and Biden. Biden was right. No, people are not going to support that. They say, okay, maybe what the president did in February 2022 was a mistake. Maybe there were other ways to do it, but now that the war has started, we cannot return to square one. We must get at least part of these 4 million Russian speakers in Ukraine in Russia, protected by our borders, our laws. We cannot give up Crimea because there are 2.5 million Russian people living there. We cannot cede the land next to Crimea because it is needed for security. Otherwise, this is a peninsula. It's very easy to cut it from water and electricity. So the picture is more complicated than just friends of peace and friends of war. There are many shades in between. There are many nuances in between, and the majority is between these poles. But very few people would say, "Oh, I support the war completely. I think it was a nice decision." And even fewer people would say, "Oh, no, stop it immediately. Just surrender. forget about the Russian population in Ukraine. The majority is in between.
Yeah, I don't add the word surrender to stop a war completely. The only way you stop a war is for the two sides to negotiate and come to some kind of agreement that isn't going to restart the war tomorrow. As long as both sides understand stopping the war to equate with surrendering, the war is never going to be stopped. I think that, there are voices in Ukraine, including the Ukrainian government, that are an exact mirror of what you just said is Russian opinion, but from the Ukrainian side, right? And
absolutely,
neither side ever says a word about what the people in the eastern provinces or the people in Crimea might want, or how we might go about figuring out what they might want, or how it's complicated by populations having been moved in and out of those areas during the war. It's all about how much does Ukraine win and how much does Russia win, and can we come up with a compromise? It's never about what the people in those provinces might wish for, right?
Well, the problem is that after the war indeed became paramount, the war actually started in 2014, the war inside Ukraine, the civil war. And there's a huge fault for it. Certainly Russia was not at fault, because if you look at what was going on for 6 months in Kiev, these were Western politicians coming there, cheering the crowds, don't surrender, continue fighting police.
There's a segment of the U.S. population that has been well aware of this ever since it happened and before.
Exactly.
They're not the majority of the U.S. population. But...
And sometimes, it was presented in the American media and in the European media something innocent. We just come there. There are peaceful, nice people standing there. Our politicians talk to them. They give them cookies and then they leave. Yes. No, it was a terribly violent coup, which continued for several months, but it was a coup. 38 policemen were killed. I mean, can you imagine if Trump's supporters in 2021, if they killed 38 policemen next to Congress in order to get there, if they used Molotov cocktails, against police, what would happen to them next day? They would all be arrested. So the Ukrainian government was powerless for a very simple reason. The former president Yanukovych was I'm sorry, a Democrat. He might be corrupt, but he was not violent. He was not a bully. And a lot of people in his government had bank accounts in the European Union and in the United States. And basically they betrayed Yanukovych, because Americans and Europeans told them, if you do not support the opposition, just remember about your money. We'll take your money. Right. But it doesn't excuse what happened in 2022, because I agree with you. This is a classical example of how you cannot stop a war by more war, Right. And this is exactly what happened. But
what can
you are exactly right. The problem is we don't know what this population really thinks. We know that in the 90s and in the 2000s, when Ukraine was a democracy, these regions, Crimea and Donbass, the East, they always voted for the most pro-Russian candidate.
Right.
But when he became president, because the Western Ukrainian population is more active politically, because you need to trade with the European Union and with the United States, that pro-Russian candidate little by little became more Ukrainian nationalist and more pro-Western. I mean, Kuchma in the beginning of his rule and Kuchma in the end of his rule, the previous president, these are two completely different political leaders. And now Kuchma supports, the Maidan and the new Ukrainian nationalist government. So it's a mystery what these people want. I think here we can agree. The war didn't help to find out the real opinion of these people, because if your life is threatened every day, if you barely survive on food aid from the government, you're not going to be free in your opinion, even if it's a very honest opinion poll, total secrecy, total anonymity. Even then, because you are not living a normal life, because you are in a very precarious situation, it's very difficult to say what you really think, what
Right.
Crimeans think. Well, more or less, it's
What I want to
yeah.
figure out, Dmitry, is what, if anything, can good people in the United States and Russia do together, ideally, or separately? I mean, here I am in the US and you in Russia, two people aware of the basics history of the problem, which is already unusual. Two people who recognize there's blame on multiple sides of this thing, which is extremely unusual. Two people who prefer peace to war, no matter the excuses for the war, which is, almost unheard of. And our governments don't want us doing what we're doing right now, talking to each other. There are sanctions, there's all the propaganda, there's all the erasure of the basic history to prevent that. But are there ways that we can get people in the US and Russia talking to each other, doing peace events together, doing demonstrations together, signing petitions or advocating change? What can people who want peace do, and what can we do to build friendships and solidarity across this border that's growing instead of shrinking?
Well, strange as this may sound for a reader of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, but Putin, during all of his rule, he met Western people, including people very hostile towards him. I participated in these Valdai Club discussions. They were attended by the people like Fiona Hill, who is now saying, "Oh, Putin will not stop in Ukraine. He will invade Poland. He will invade Baltics." She has been saying that for 10 years. That never happened. So with Putin, strange as it may seem, he is tolerant of various opinions, especially from Westerners, especially if these opinions are more or less pacifist. Uh, the US, we have a very strange situation, I think, in the US. I think both you and me, we agree that Donald Trump is not an ideal person, to put it mildly. Morally, he is, I'm sorry, obnoxious. But this is one of the cases when you have a basically immoral person against an even more immoral and belligerent ideology. The problem is that Joe Biden and before him Barack Obama and most of the European Union leaders now, they profess this ideology which divides the world into democracies and autocracies. And the terrible thing is that they think that democracies have the right to attack autocracies or to help internal turmoil, help internal subversion to change them from within, the so-called regime change. This is a terrible ideology. Putin, imperfect as he is, his policy was for many years, okay, we don't support dissent in the United States. We expect the United States not to try to change our regime. That was the gentleman's agreement that he suggested to the West. The West never accepted it. So I would say, I think we share even certain things on history. For example, I hate when people in Russia praise Stalin because Stalin won the war. This is the usual excuse for him. He killed several million people because of his terrible ideology. But people say, but he won the war. First, it was not he, but the people who won the war, defended, saving their lives. And second, the Bolshevist ideology, in many ways, made that war possible. So what I admired about your book, is that despite you went against the majority in the United States and in Russia admires FDR Roosevelt, admires him. Oh, he won the war. He went against the Japanese. He went against the Germans. And you admire Henry Cabot Lodge, who basically was an opponent of Roosevelt, as far as I remember, and who tried to outlaw the war, right? As far as I remember. You correct me if I'm wrong.
Henry Cabot Lodge was not the leader of that movement to outlaw war, but Roosevelt certainly was the opponent of it, who did not want the public to have a say. You know, they were going to make a public referendum requirement in the 30s for a war, and Roosevelt said, no, we can't have that. We must have wars no matter what the public thinks. So
if you want me to tell you the best case scenario is, to my mind, the best case scenario is a return to a situation when wars cannot be started by individual leaders, because this is becoming too dangerous. You remember that in the United States, this is the reason why so many people migrated from Europe to the United States. You needed congressional approval for a war. In Europe, a monarch or a president could start the war. You know, the French president could start the war. Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany could start the war. The Tsar could start the war in Russia. In America, you needed congressional approval.
Well, not 1941. Congress hasn't done that.
So. Exactly. Well, I mean, it changed in the middle of the 20th century, and under Truman, it was that, you know, this idea, because I remember the arguments for it. You cannot have a congressional hearing.
We have 1 minute.
Yeah, we cannot have a congressional hearing. This is a decision to be made in a matter of seconds. Well, I mean, now we have very unstable people like Donald Trump, or even worse, European leaders, who take the decision on the wars in a matter of minutes. This is a more dangerous situation than having a congressional hearing on a war. So if you ask me what's the best case scenario, it's a return to a more legalistic, more cautious approach to wars. This is what we should be demanding.
I would love to see it. I would love to see either the United States or Russia take the lead on that, on democratizing the United Nations, on abolishing the nuclear weapons, on upholding the rule of law. I hope it happens. We'll have to resume this conversation on another show because we're out of time. Dmitry Babich, thank you for what you're doing and for coming on Talk World Radio.
Thank you. And I hope we will find even better places to discuss it. On RT, you can voice these opinions, by the way. I hope in a few months, maybe in a few years, this will be the mainstream opinion also in the United States, and I hope in Europe a little later.
We will hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is Talk World Radio. I'm David Swanson. Take action at rootsaction.org. Help end war at worldbeyondwar.org. Read or listen to today's Peace Almanac entry at peacealmanac.org. All past shows can be heard at talkworldradio.org. Talk World Radio is produced in Charlottesville, Virginia, and syndicated by Pacifica Network. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.